They set fire to the barns in which the harvest has been gathered, and they slaughter all the animals and set fire to them as well. So I think Orderic Vitalis says, he gathered together and had them all destroyed with consuming fire, that sort of thing. This is what the Victorians dubbed the harrying of the North.
The year 1066 is the most famous date in English history, when William of Normandy defeated Harold II of England and won himself a crown and the epithet, the Conqueror. But there is a lot more to it than just one bloody battle at Hastings. You'll find half a century of invasion and political manoeuvring before it, and decades of brutal subjugation afterwards. Medieval historian Marc Morris is an expert in the subject. His books include The Norman Conquest and The Anglo-Saxons, and in this 4-part podcast series he talks to me, David Musgrove, about the full story of the Norman Conquest. So welcome to 1066, the battle for England. This is episode 4, The Long and Violent Conquest of England. We have talked through the run-up to the battle. We've talked about the politics and power play that happened throughout the 11th century, and we've established the drama of the battle itself. And now we need to look at the aftermath. So last time we talked, Mark, Duke William had won the Battle of Hastings, he was advancing on London, and the people of London were about to submit to him. What happens?
Yeah, well, I mean, they submit is what happens. And then he enters London in the very last days of the year. So we can't be more precise than that. But at some point, probably early mid-December, he's in London and making immediate preparations for his coronation. Because what we're told by the sources is that the English who came and submitted to him pleaded with him to take the crown at this point, because it said they were used to having a king and they needed to be ruled over by a king. The reason for that being, as I think I said in the previous episode, the Normans had been ravaging, looting, pillaging, harrying the countryside as they went. And they might have continued to do this until William was accepted as king. So they wanted, basically the English wanted the period of hostilities to end. They wanted to submit and then to be ruled in a lawful, peaceful way. So they submit in order to achieve that. And William, we're told, was hesitant because this was only a subsection of the English. Not all the English were ready to submit. But he's persuaded to enter London and be crowned. And the coronation is the date they chose is Christmas Day because it's a very holy day. And that takes place, the coronation, in Westminster Abbey. We said earlier in the previous podcast that Harold might have been crowned in Westminster Abbey. It's the likeliest location. But William is the first king we can say for certain was crowned in Westminster Abbey. The coronation doesn't go exactly to plan. Again, we're fairly well informed about this. The main source, I haven't really described in any detail for what happens in the next few years, is the life of William written by his chaplain, William of Poitiers. And just as a sort of a way of characterising that as an aside, it is, like the sources we mentioned earlier, incredibly biased because it's written for William's court, if not for William's own ears, and therefore it reads like the kind of cloying, obsequious prose that you would expect to be heaped on any modern autocratic leader. It's not going to say anything critical. Having said all of that, it is written by William's chaplain. This is a man who is about as close to William as you can get, a man who may have heard William confessing his sins. So biased, yes. Well-informed, absolutely. So, that's the balancing act you have to negotiate with William of Poitiers. William of Poitiers says of the coronation that, up to a certain point it was going fine. And then there was a tumult, there was a disruption outside the abbey. The people outside the abbey panicked when they heard the English shout their approval for William's reign inside the abbey, and they panicked and started to set fire to the buildings outside, which makes absolutely no sense whichever way you slice it. You don't, we burnt Westminster down in a panic, because we thought something was going wrong. So it seems much more likely that the people stationed outside the abbey were just looting or pillaging or continuing that process of conquest. And and it got out of control. There was either resistance or violence and burning, and it escalated to the extent that people abandoned the coronation service and the people ran out. And William, we're told, was left only attended by the officiating clergy who were in the process of crowning him, and was shaking from head to foot as the crown was being placed on his head. So in terms of auspiciousness, it ain't great as a way to launch your reign. When people are expecting you to bring order and peace, that this is the chaotic scene that attends your coronation.
Yeah. But notwithstanding that, he was crowned. He did get the crown on his head.
Yes, which is very important.
And so does that mean then that after that he basically has the support of the people he needs and is able to start to establish his rule?
Well, the people who submit to him there's a bit of a grey area, because some of the sources imply that Edwin and Morcar were there and submitted prior to the coronation. William of Poitiers, who, as I've said, biased but supremely well informed, gives the impression that they submitted just afterwards in a separate ceremony at Barking, to the east of London in Essex. I suppose you might say it doesn't really matter. Within some point around the Christmas period, everybody who counts in England has submitted to William. And at that point on, he is able to rule with a semblance of peacefulness. He's able to the crucial thing is that the English are submitting to him, and that he is making peace with them and selling them back their lands, which sounds, very sort of, I think, offensive or cheeky, to people say, well, how dare you? These have always been my lands. But William's line was like, well, you rebelled against me. I'm your lawful king. You chose to support Harold. Harold was a usurper. This is the Norman logic. And so in rebelling against me, your rightful king, you have forfeited your lands, but I will graciously grant them back to you in return for a payment of, a large sum of money. But in all of this, although this might sound unreasonable, the great contrast here is what happened after Canute's coronation, because Canute said, "Don't like the look of you," and chopped the head off. So the thing that is striking about the Norman conquest as compared to the Danish conquest is that William, in the first instance, is presenting himself as Edward the Confessor's legitimate heir. He's not styling himself William the Conqueror. Canute and the Vikings, this is the beautiful simplicity of Vikings. They're unapologetic about that. It's like, we won, we smashed your faces in, and now we're in charge. William is basically saying this has been a legal dispute that's now been settled by God Almighty on the battlefield, and now I'm your legitimate king. I'm the Confessor's designated heir, and you are my lawful subject. So they submit, and he gives them their lands back. And the consequence is you get initially this enormous tension between the surviving English, who are many, and the incoming Normans, who have been promised the world. They have been promised riches galore. So how do you balance everyone's expectations? I would like to have the lands I had before the conquest. I would like the prize I was promised for risking everything to help you win this victory. That is the balancing act of the opening years of William's reign, and it doesn't go terribly well.
Yeah. So because William took a more civilized approach to conquest than Canute did, he made himself some problems in terms of actually managing the kingdom.
I think my general take on this is that the English have been used to being conquered for the previous century or so, or half a century at least. And they felt in 1066 that they hadn't actually been properly conquered. Yes, he's won one battle for heaven's sake. And yes, he's been crowned. But that's nothing that can't be fixed with, dropping something into his drinking horn, or another battle. We'll have another vote on this. We'll put it to God for a second time, and then we'll get rid of them. You and I know, nearly 1,000 years on, that 1066 is the one date that everyone is going to remember, and it's the great tipping point in the history of England. They don't know that as they're living through it. It could have just been another blip.
Yeah.
1067. But they could have been saying, "Do you remember that episode with the Normans? What happened there?" So it could just be. Like Edmund Ironside. Edmund Ironside in a different parallel universe could have reigned 40 years, and the Norman conquest couldn't have happened. But he had 4 successful battles and then one complete failure. The Norman conquest, I think the English in 1066, the start of 1067, thought, this is eminently reversible. He hasn't even killed anybody. I mean, he's killed the Godwinsons. He's killed Harold and 2 of his brothers who fell in battle. So Team Godwin has taken a pounding at Hastings. But there's plenty of us left if we feel that this guy isn't working out for us.
Yeah.
So what that means is there are any number of revolts and rebellions in the years that follow as they try and relitigate 1066 and reverse that verdict.
All right, we'll talk about some of them in just a sec. But before we do that, I wonder what the reaction to William's conquest of England is across Europe, and particularly with the papacy. We talked in the 3rd episode about William's appeal to the Pope for support. Was the Pope thinking, "Oh, this is great stuff. It's great to see 2 Christian kings going at it"?
Well, as I say, I don't think we have enough evidence to say, but my reading of the evidence remains that the papal blessing of the conquest did actually predate it, and therefore what happens afterwards is trophies galore are sent to the papacy. This is something that, I mean, in all the effusive stuff that William of Poitiers writes, it's about, it's basically that they clearly fill their boots on a grand scale, the Normans. So and a lot of the people who follow William to England do go home having filled their caskets with treasure and disappear or paid off. I mean, William it's in March 1067 when as he's going back to Normandy for a victory parade there. That's where he pays off his army. So anyone who's sort of serving him for coin does very well. And as I say, loads of treasures are heaped off and sent as a thank you to the Pope. So, that's as much as I can say about the reaction of the papacy. In more general terms, the reaction across Europe is mixed. And this is fast-forwarding somewhat because I don't think these are immediate reactions. But Elizabeth van Hoots did a very good paper on this about 20 years ago about the Norman Conquest through European eyes. And she says that, in Francia, by and large, so in what we would now think of as France, across all those territories, there's a general sense of, well, this is a victory of Frankish arms. That he's one of us broadly. The Normans are one of us, and also William. I say the Normans. William is recruited very widely to his banner. So there are people in his army from Brittany, from Anjou, from Maine, and from parts further afield. So it's seen as being like allez les bleus. Very well done, well done us. Beyond Francia, not so much. There's a couple of German chroniclers. Wenric of Trier is one whose name wedges in my mind. And he talks about, he's writing to the future Gregory VII, I think. And he says, you've championed kings who've, beaten a bloody part of the throne and, put a bloodstained crown on their heads, that sort of thing. He doesn't mention William by name, but it's clear who he's talking about. So, there was clearly alarm at the amount of bloodshed, but some of that is about the bloodshed that followed, because although the death toll at Hastings must have been very considerable, it is as nothing compared to the death toll in the years that came after. Yeah.
And I guess just thinking a little bit more about Europe, I suppose the Hungarians would have been terribly happy about their man Edgar not being on the throne. Did Edgar, it's probably hard to know that, I'm not expecting you to know the answer to that, but did Edgar become like a focus for resistance and sort of a cause célèbre for these rebels?
Well, he does, but not immediately. Very soon. I mean, the initial resistance is led by the remnants of the Godwin family. So we have, although Harold had married the sister of his former rivals Edwin and Morcar around the start of 1066. He'd been married in a less official way. I mean, married. I mean, this is the point. You don't need the church to sanctify your marriage. So he had been married to all intents and purposes for 20-odd years to a woman called Edith Swanneck, and had strapping sons, who are probably in their mid to late teens. And he also, although all his brothers have been killed in 1066 except for Wulfnulf, who is still in Norman captivity, his mother, Gutha, she is still at large and and plotting her revenge. Because I mean, if, goodness me, we talked about the strong women in this story, but she's a story in her own right. And she has seen, as a result of the Norman Conquest, all of her sons, destroyed in one way or another. She had 5 or 6 sons. They've all perished either early, or they perished in the last year, or they're in captivity. So she now turns to the next generation, Harold's sons, her grandsons, and tries to muster a resistance from the West Country and from Ireland, which William stamps out at the start of 1068. There's a big siege of Exeter. So initially, it's the remnants of the Godwin family. But then they have been trying to orchestrate something larger. They've been sending emissaries to Scandinavia. That larger rebellion starts to gain a head of steam in the summer of 1068, and especially into 1069. I mean, William is marching into these areas and almost in anticipation of rebellion in the summer of 1068. So the Midlands and York, so places like off the top of my head, Nottingham, Warwick, Lincoln, Cambridge, etc., Huntingdon. We're told they all get new castles planted in their midst. But that's not in itself enough. And what we get in 1069 is 2 further risings out the north. The first is a spontaneous local uprising that begins in Durham and spreads to York, and then in the summer, the late summer of 1069, we get another rising that coincides with an invasion from Denmark. So again, I go back to my point that we know 1066 works out well for the Normans in the long run. But the when you read the sources, especially for 1069, about all the Northumbrians and all the Danes, sort of all the Scandinavians sweeping south, there seems to be a brio, a confidence in there that this is the end of the Norman Conquest. And honestly, the way that the warfare and the politics go that autumn, I suspect William thought that everything hung in the balance as well. Yeah. It doesn't look like William's in control. He's run ragged, trying to stamp out these fires all over the country.
So is 1069 the moment of sort of greatest peril for William's reign? I
would say, in terms of arguably, you could say he has the same fear at the very end in 1085, 1086, which we may get onto, but that is that's a threatened Scandinavian invasion on a grand scale that never sets sail. This is a Scandinavian invasion that actually, lands in Yorkshire and is accompanied by a big native rebellion. So in terms of, actually being up against it, 1069 is about as bad as it gets for William.
Yeah. And this is the moment when the bloodshed that you talked about that follows the conquest really starts to happen, right?
Well, there's in all these rebellions that we talked about from 1067, 1068 and into 1069, clearly thousands of people are dying because there's burning and harrying and slaughtering on both sides, day and night. But what happens in the autumn of 1069 is William gets to a point where he marches his army up to Yorkshire, and the Danes are stationed on the other side of the River Humber, where the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says he could not get at them. So he's been campaigning for months, and this enemy still remains at large. And so what he elects to do, and bearing in mind this, I'm not trying to mount a justification for this, I'm just trying to sort of think my way into his mind. This is his 3rd campaign in the north in 18 months, and every time he builds a castle in York, it's burnt to the ground and its garrison is slaughtered. What he decides to do at that point is the most notorious act of his life. He breaks up his army and sends it all over Yorkshire with instructions to make Yorkshire untenable, unlivable. So they go around and they set fire to the barns in which the harvest has been gathered, and they slaughter all the animals and set fire to them as well. So I think Orderic Vitalis says, he gathered together and had them all destroyed with consuming fire, that sort of thing. This is what the Victorians dubbed the harrying of the North. And people often imagine that it was like Normans going around deliberately slaughtering people. I dare say people who said, "Oh, that's my barn, that's my prize calf," did get killed. But actually the contemporary sources don't mention people getting put to the sword. All they say is the Normans went round laying waste to Yorkshire and, points north of the Humber. And the consequences of that are in the weeks and months that followed, without that carefully harvested food, these people starved to death in their tens of thousands. And this is one of those terrible occasions where I said earlier, in terms of troop numbers, when medieval chroniclers say 100,000 people, we think, oh, it's just impossible. No way could it be that many. In the case of the Harrying of the North, Orderic Vitalis, our best source, says more than 100,000 people perished. And for a long time, people said, oh, it's just a chronicler exaggeration. And then John Palmer in the 1990s crunched all the data for Doomsday Book for Yorkshire and said, well, the population drop is well into six figures, just for Yorkshire. So, more than 100,000 people perished as a result of that man-made famine that William had induced.
So pretty serious stuff. I wonder, so we got all these rebels in England and rebels coming from Scandinavia as well. I wonder, we haven't really talked about what was going on elsewhere in Britain and Wales and Scotland. Presumably the rulers there might have seen opportunities to advance their positions as well. And sort of moving that conversation on, how quickly does the Norman conquest of England start to have an impact beyond the boundaries of England?
Well, I can answer this question reasonably well with regard to Wales, because this is the subject of my next book, is a kind of, what happened beyond England in the post-conquest period, in the centuries that followed the conquest. And in the case of Wales, a chapter I've already written, they are going into Wales very early on. From 1067, they're crossing the River Wye and moving out from Chester and grabbing whatever they can for themselves. And their initial successes are relatively short-lived, especially in the north. By the 1093, 1094, there's a very big rebellion across all of Wales, and a lot of those successes are undone. The reason that the Norman conquest ultimately takes a very long time in Wales and is half complete at best is because geographically Wales is a very difficult place to conquer, and that means, so by that I mean it's mostly upland and very difficult to move troops around. And also, let's be honest, if it's upland, large parts of it aren't worth conquering. If it's not arable, then it's not productive. Or it's not as productive and as valuable. But that means that in terms of Wales politically, Wales has never is not been politically united in the way that England has been for a century or so. So England is mostly lowland. It is a precociously well-governed, well-organised state, which you can take over fairly quickly and efficiently. When they get to Wales, that's not the case, and it ends up becoming an ongoing war of attrition with a galaxy of competing Welsh rulers. So that's Wales. Scotland, I found in recent weeks, that everything I thought I knew about Scotland, including where it was and who lived there, has been revised in the last 25 years of scholarship since I last looked. I would have said, and I think I said in my book on the Norman Conquest, that the kings of Scots have been inching their way south of the Forth for a century prior to 1066. Now that seems that's probably not the case. But what happens as a result of the conquest is it presents the Scots with a king of Scots with a great opportunity, because the Normans are sort of inching their way north from, say, Yorkshire, let's say north of the Tees. And there's a polity sort of at that point, beyond that point, which is modern historians call the Bamborough polity, as in Bamburgh Castle. It's sort of more or less an independent political entity that lies out with England and out with Scotland. And that seems to kind of crumble and be carved up in the 1080s, 1090s. You've got Normans sort of pushing north and the King of Scots pushing south. The reason Scotland ultimately differs from Wales in this regard is the kingship of the Scots is sufficiently sort of strong that the Normans are able to kind of feel that this is a polity they can do business with.
Okay, taking it back to England again. So a few years after 1066, William's taking a much firmer line with the country and dealing with rebellions with a very harsh hand, by the sound of things. At what point, to go back to the earlier point you were making about his difficulties of appealing to his Norman followers and keeping his English people on side in terms of land distribution, at what point do English rulers start to lose their lands?
It's the harrying. I mean, the harrying is, I think, the point where that idea of a balanced polity and any pretense of kind of like, I'm your legitimate king, let's all sort of, have a council meeting and discuss this. That's the point where that collapses. I think that's and you can see that in the composition of his court. So if you look at the way we, as medieval historians, determine who's in and who's out of court, is by looking at the witness lists to royal charters. So every time the king gives a grant of land, no matter how large or consequential, it will say, given by my hand at this particular place. And these people are the witnesses. And from the people in the witness list, you can say, oh, look, the Archbishop of Canterbury is there, the Earl of Norfolk is there, and so on and so forth. And what you see with the witness lists to William's charters in 1068, and 1067 as well, but as late as 1068, is that it's still a mixed society with English bishops and English earls, like Edwin and Morcar, alongside Norman bishops and Norman newcomers. By the time you get to 1070... that's changed entirely, especially by the time you get to the end of his reign. There's one particular charter in 1086, huge long witness list, and there's not a single English name among them, about 80 or 90 people. So, yes, there's a sense from that point on that the English are not to be trusted. It's also very apparent in what happens with the church immediately after the harrying of the north. So as soon as he's come south in the spring of 1070, there are church councils at, I forget which order they come in, Winchester and Windsor. And the leading lights of the church, presumably because they're seen to be complicit in the rebellion, are just removed. So Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, goes at that point and is imprisoned. They're not just kind of like, time for you to retire, we need a Norman replacement. But I think it's up to 5 bishops in the space of that year. And countless numbers, a lot of abbots are also, either demoted or imprisoned. So there's a cull or a clearing out of the English Church at that point. And from that, even from that early date on, I think there's only 2 native English bishops still in post. By the end of the reign, it's just one, Wulfstan of Worcester. So, and that what's true of the Church is true of the aristocracy as a whole. And there's a kind of a vicious cycle that develops, because I said at the beginning, William regarded the English who had fought at Hastings as rebels. People who'd supported Harold were complicit in rebellion against William. So he said, well, your lands are forfeit, but I will sell them back to you. But there were lots of people who lost their lands altogether. The Godwinsons, for example, all of the vast estates of the Godwin family, they were forfeit. So the penalty for rebellion is forfeiture. If then people continue to rebel, then you seize their lands. It's like, well, what becomes of those rebels? They take to the woods, they take to the hills. They have no stake in society. They continue to rebel, and so that rebellion generates more dispossession. So it becomes this vicious cycle, which quite quickly, within 5 or 6 years of the reign beginning, I think, means that the majority of English landholders have been dispossessed, and you see that at the end of the reign in Domesday Book. Domesday Book is brilliant because it shows us the circumstances in both 1086 when it was compiled and 1066. It is one of the principal reasons for its compilation is because they are trying to sort out the terrible mess that has become of landholding England as a result of all this dispossession. But what it ultimately shows is that about 95% of the country in 1086 is owned by continental newcomers now. Held, I should say, by continental newcomers, and only about 5% is in the hands of Englishmen. So it just goes to show you this is the major effect of the conquest: is that the ruling class of England has been almost completely replaced. By people who have only come from across the Channel, but nevertheless have different ideas in their heads about the way society should be regulated.
So just thinking about the sort of the legacy of the conquest then. So that's one aspect, I guess, is landholding and changes in landholding.
Well, this is where I'm not a legal scholar, so I would say that the major thing to take away from Domesday Book is the almost total replacement of one ruling class by another, foreign ruling class who, I mean, just one example that, because this is the question that you're heading towards, I think, is, how does that change things? The fact that they spoke French and the fact that the Old English class spoke Old English, has huge impact that we're, still evident today. The fact that we're not speaking in a language that sounds like Dutch is a direct consequence of the takeover in 1066. And that wouldn't have been the case had it been more like the Danish conquest, where there are a few powerful Danes for a few years, but ultimately the English elite reestablishes themselves. The Norman conquest is a complete and total elite takeover. And when I say elite, probably 10, 20,000 people, or maybe in Doomsday Book, it's about 9,000 people you can see that who are brand new and from the continent. And that must mean that in almost every village or every manor, 9 times out of 10, there's a new lord in charge who doesn't know anything about England, knows nothing of its history, knows nothing of its customs, doesn't know how to speak the language, but knows how, you get people to do things. You build a castle and you build a new church and you tell them what to do. And, so, new customs are introduced at that point, as well as the huge linguistic shift you see.
So if you weren't unlucky enough to be subject to the harrying of the North, and you were just a lowly English peasant, you would definitely still have felt the impact of this conquest pretty quickly then, because of the change in ownership. Yeah,
I mean, what other things can we talk about? Well, I mean, the visible things that are still with us today, castles. If you go around the country today and you count up all the castle sites in England and Wales, there are, give or take, about 1,000. And at a very conservative estimate, about 600 of those were built before the end of the 11th century. And the preponderance of them built during the reign of William the Conqueror quite early on as weapons of conquest. So wherever you went in England, there are hundreds of men labouring on these great, earth and timber fortifications of a kind that had not been seen in England prior to that point. That's something that is writ large in the chronicles, Anglo-Saxon chronicle. They built castles throughout the land and oppressed poor men, that sort of thing. So chances are you would be forced to build a castle as an instrument of, oppression / lordship. Old English churches ripped down and rebuilt in a new Romanesque style, which sounds kind of like, oh, that's just a change in fashion. But Old English churches were very old, and they had been there in many cases since the 7th century when the English converted. And the reason they looked ramshackle to the Normans was because they themselves were a kind of architectural relic. This is the part of the church that was built by St. Eanswythe or St. Wulfstan or whoever. And the Normans looked at these things and said, just aesthetically, it's a dog's breakfast. So they levelled them to the ground and built a nice new Romanesque church. You'd have noticed that, if you were an Anglo-Saxon peasant, as well as the kind of constant warfare going on around you, as well as the change in lordship. The other thing that, people often say, well, the Normans introduced the feudal system, which is kind of like, we haven't got time to go there. But certainly what they did as new conquerors, new colonists, was they made people work harder in return for less. And you can see that writ large in Doomsday Book. Now he used to hold this freely. Now he holds it in heaviness and misery, is a famous entry. But the number of free men falls wherever you go. And people who have previously said, I'm a stout yeoman and I farm this land freely, are now being told, no, you don't. You own this land. You hold this land from me, and in return for it, you do 3 days a week on my domain. So that whole kind of social contract across the country is being renegotiated in favour of lords and to the detriment of peasants. So, there's this notion that, it only affected the elite and, most people were just ploughing the fields and it didn't make any difference is I think, redundant.
What about the question of slavery and slaves? Because you make the point in your book that in pre-Norman England, I think it was 10% of the population were probably slaves. Does that change?
Yes. I mean, that's one of the things that I often lead with that, and I didn't in this case because it's a smaller percentage. But that's the sort of flip side to saying the majority of people who were free were told more or less at sword point that you're not as free as you thought you were. Because we're in charge now, and this is the new deal. And at the very bottom of society in Anglo-Saxon England, people were slaves in the sort of classical or early modern sense, i.e. they were human chattels, and they could be sort of, families could be broken up, individual people could be brought to market and sold, and they said, this person is very attractive, she'll fetch a good price, or this young man is very strong, he'll fetch a good price, and sold and like animals with no rights, no better rights than animals. That changes with the Norman Conquest. For all their brutality in war and all the bloodshed that goes with the Norman Conquest. The Normans had sort of abandoned that kind of chattel slavery a generation or two before 1066. And as I say in the book, where we can measure it in Domesday Book, which I think, to be fair, is only Essex, where we can measure the change in Domesday Book, the number of slaves falls by 25%. And within a generation or so, by the mid-12th century, even by the second quarter of the 12th century, chattel slavery is on the way out. So the Normans did things different. They held different attitudes towards the way society should be regulated, which meant that many more people who have been free are suddenly now told, no, you're to some extent servile. And the people who had been in an abject state of slavery, their lot is improved because they can at least stay on the land with their families and they can't be killed with impunity. The Norman Conquest, for those people that survived the killing, was, I think, an unmitigated tragedy. And that's something that comes through very clearly in the sources we have for the early 12th century. I'm not here to sort of tell you that the Norman Conquest was a good thing, but it was one of those occasions where just history speeds up. That's what makes it so fascinating. And I think I'm just going to anticipate a final question here. Is often people say to me, what if it hadn't happened? What if William had lost at Hastings? And you catalogue all of these things that changed: architecture, military tactics, population, etc., etc. And you say, well, probably it would have all happened anyway. You'd have got Romanesque eventually. It would have been more long drawn out and piecemeal. There probably more surviving Old English churches, but you'd have got Romanesque eventually because that's the way the wind would blow. You'd have got chivalry. You'd have got knights. You'd have got castles. All of these things would have come, but they would have come at an organic rate. And what makes the conquest fascinating is because of that total replacement of the ruling class, it comes like the next day, new people in charge, and the sort of the clash, the culture clashes as a result. Is what generates all this kind of comment and heat and interest at a distance of 1,000 years from the point of view of the historian.
Did it speed up changes in the condition of women at all? I mean, this story we've talked about had some strong female characters, from Emma, Edith, Gitta.
Yeah.
Did it change?
That is an argument that was put that since at least the 18th century and put very trenchantly in the interwar years. Dorothy Whitlock is the name to conjure with here. I think Whitlock said that prior to the conquest, the men and women had a rough and ready equality, and more recent, more nuanced studies. Pauline Stafford is the one, Women in the Norman Conquest, suggest that really, this is not, if not built on sand, that there's very little evidence that this was the case, because the women who are seen to be, this woman had really strong rights before the conquest, or in Domesday Book, they're holding lands. It's like 95% of the cases they're either royal or the wives of earls, countesses. So in terms of what the rights were of ordinary women before the conquest, we're kind of either left guessing, but they don't seem to be any worse than they were after the conquest. So I think it's one of those things that belongs to the sort of in the category of Anglo-Saxon golden ageism. So after the conquest, people like William of Malmesbury are looking back on the Saxon period and saying, in the old days, everything was better. The kings were wiser and more literate and more pious. Women had. He doesn't make this argument, but this is an 18th century. Women had better rights. Basically, before we had these guys in charge, it was a golden age, and that's one manifestation of it. I think the women had better rights before the conquest. I think the sad reality is no, they didn't.
Okay, last thing. William dies in 1087. You mentioned earlier that there was that sort of threat of invasion in a few years before that. does William die sort of safe and happy in his bed, secure in having established his kingdom and his dynasty?
Safe and happy, no, clearly. So let's just talk briefly about describing his death. He, having compiled Domesday Book, he set sail for Normandy in the late summer of 1086, never to return to England. So he hasn't spent much of the previous decade or so in England, but he goes back to Normandy because he has ongoing conflicts with his neighbours, particularly the King of France. And in retaliating for an attack on Normandy by the King of France, he's attacking and burning the French town of Mantes, and he somehow is taken ill. Some later chroniclers say he fell from his horse, or his horse reared up in fright and the pommel of his saddle pushed into his stomach and wounded him. But one way or another he becomes ill, is clearly dying, is taken back to Rouen, and after a matter of days is moved outside of the tumult of the city to the monastery of Saint-Gervais, which is outside. And he spends weeks dying. He has a great big long deathbed speech in Orderic Vitalis, which is clearly made up, but it's clearly a very long, drawn-out, agonising and painful death. And, he has a lot on his conscience. He has the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people on his conscience. In crude political terms, I think by that point he must have felt fairly certain that his grip on England was secure. Though what was going to become of it after his death, he's probably left guessing, because however good these kings are as warriors, war leaders, politicians, they are invariably pretty rubbish when it comes to raising stable families or, inculcating any sense of loyalty among their offspring. So, not for the first time in English history, we have this bun fight between his three sons, his successors. And he's already, for the past 10 years at least, his eldest son has been on and off, Robert Curthose, in rebellion against him. And he's still in rebellion at the point where William dies. So he dies really not knowing which way the chips are going to fall, which of his sons will succeed him. William Rufus, he wants to succeed him, the second son. We know William Rufus does succeed him, but William doesn't know that when he gasps his last on September the 9th, 1087.
Brilliant. Okay, let's finish up. Why is 1066 and all that still something that should resonate with everybody today?
I think, why does 1066 still matter? Because the conquest leads to the replacement, more or less wholesale replacement, of the English ruling class, by which I mean everybody who was anybody in England down to a fairly low tenurial level. It means that huge sweeping social change follows. So the language that we speak today would be the long-lasting legacy of the conquest as a result of that influx of the powerful. If you wanted to get on in post-conquest England for at least the next 50 years, you better start learning French. Okay, so there's an awful lot of loan words from French, etc. And loads of other social change that follows. Things, just to recap them, that we talked about. We talked about, like, if not the introduction of feudalism, then the intensification of lordship, the demise of slavery, the introduction of chivalry. Very important. I mean, we've talked about the way in which the Anglo-Saxons went about doing politics, which was, if someone was in the way, you bump them off. If someone was an inconvenient king, then you slip something into their drinking horn, or just scalp them or murdered them or blinded them. That Game of Thrones style way of doing politics was par for the course. And however much monastic chroniclers might have lamented it, clearly the political elite kind of thought that was an acceptable way to behave. That goes out the window after 1066. No man dared slay another, says the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, no matter what evil he might have done him. And, this always seems a hard sell when I mention this because, we think of the Normans as being, as Orderic Vitalis said, like a scourge of God smiting them for their sins. But when it came to politics, they didn't deliberately do each other in. They captured, they imprisoned, they ransomed. And if you look at, every generation after the conquest, if you look at earls, the highest rank of English noblemen, Earl Waltheof is killed in 1076 on William's orders. The next earl to be judicially executed in England after 1076 is the Scottish Earl of Atholl, who's executed by Edward I in 1306, 230 years later. So the Norman Conquest introduces new standards of political behaviour for the elite. And as we've already touched upon, it means that because the English elite and ultimately the English as a whole imbibe these new attitudes, they start to look at their neighbours, the Welsh and the Scots and ultimately the Irish, and judge them by this new moral yardstick. So they start to say, well, these people are slave raiders and slave traders. Now, once upon a time, the English would have said, just like us. But now they're saying these people are barbarians because they are people in need of civilizing. And that you start to see coming in a couple of generations after the conquest. And that attitude towards, for want of a better word, the Celts to the north and west, that underpins and informs the English advance into those areas in the next several centuries. So it's hugely consequential, 1066, and there's at least half a dozen reasons there why you should care about it.
Amazing stuff. Thank you so much. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I'm sure there's many other things we could have talked about, but I think we covered quite a few of the bases.
Most of the things we haven't covered are in the book I wrote in 2012. So, yeah, that's where you'll find more of the answers.
Actually, that is one thing we were going to say. Has anything changed in the past decade in terms of our understanding of the Norman Conquest?
I did sort of try and do a review of the literature between writing about the conquest and writing about at least the end of Anglo-Saxon England. And the thing that I think I did touch on it when we talked about King Canute is the sense that previously my impression of Canute was he was just great and very, very successful. And I hadn't really considered how very difficult it must have been to be English at any level, particularly at an elite level, between 1016 and 1030, say 1042, simply because you are having to adjust to this new reality where the people you have been fighting against and taught were these just dreadful pagan demons, attacking you for the previous 100 years. They're now the people in charge, and you have to make your peace with that. And some people went all in, like the Godwins, and said, we're fine with that. And for other people, it was clearly much more difficult. So I considered it more from the English point of view as I was finishing the tale of the English down to 1066. But there's always, that's the thing about academic scholarship is it's very, very dynamic, and there's always new stuff coming to light, brilliant new theories being advanced, and that will continue. Long may that continue.